Winter in Morgan County came in hard that year, the kind of cold that seemed to sharpen the edges of the land. Snow lay unbroken across the fields, a white sheet stretched so tight it muffled the sound of boots. Joseph Maddox had walked that stretch countless times, hauling feed between his property and the old creek road. But on that January morning in 1908, the clearing ahead did not look the same. A dark shape stood in the open space where he had last seen only wind-bent weeds. A house, sudden and complete, as if it had been set down overnight. Its wood was gray, stripped of paint, and its windows were all fitted not with glass but with heavy curtains, thick and deep red, swaying slightly though there was no wind. Maddox slowed, his breath rising in pale clouds, a creeping unease making the hair at the back of his neck rise. He told himself it was just an old hunting cabin he had somehow never noticed. Yet something in the stillness of it, the way it seemed to be watching him, made his pace falter. When he stepped closer, he saw there were no doors, not a single hinge, no frame. Only more of those red curtains hanging in the spaces where doors should be. They did not billow like cloth should. They seemed heavier, as though they carried weight in their folds. The snow around the structure was pristine, no tracks leading to it, no marks where something had been dragged or built. Maddox stood at the threshold, close enough now to see the stitching along the edges, careful and tight, every seam identical, as if sewn by one unerring hand over years. His fingers twitched toward the knife at his belt, some mixture of caution and stubborn curiosity pushing him to test what he was looking at. The blade was sharp from morning sharpening. He slipped it between the folds and cut downward in one steady pull. The sound was wrong, not the tearing of fabric, but something softer, wetter, almost like a sigh pressed out of my lungs. A thick droplet fell onto the snow at his feet, steaming faintly in the cold air. Maddox jerked his hand back, staring at the stain blooming crimson on the white crust. He waited for the liquid to freeze as blood should in such temperatures, but it remained soft, sinking into the snow. His grip on the knife tightened. For a moment he thought of cutting again, but an unease heavier than fear pressed on his ribs. He wiped the blade on his coat and stepped back, his boots making the first marks in the clearing. Behind him the curtains swayed once more, though the air was perfectly still. It was then he noticed something else. A faint shape behind the red fabric, tall and unmoving, its outline sharp enough to suggest shoulders, a head, a body standing perfectly still on the other side. He waited for it to shift or retreat, but it remained there, as if watching him through the weave. The cold began to bite through his coat, yet he could not shake the feeling that the warmth behind those curtains was not the kind any living man should stand in. By the time Maddox made it back to the road, his heart was thudding in a way that felt wrong for a man of his age and work. He told himself to forget it, to leave the place alone. Yet by evening the story had already begun to slip from his lips over the stove to his wife. He meant it as a warning, but the moment he spoke the words, "curtains that bled," her face closed and she shook her head sharply. He did not understand then, but she had heard that phrase before, years ago, from her own father, who had warned her never to wander toward the Bell property. In the days that followed, Maddox found the clearing again, though not by choice. Something about its location was wrong. He would turn a corner in the woods and see it from a new angle, the red curtains dull against the snow. It was never far, no matter where he started. Once he thought he saw a hand part the fabric, pale fingers curling around the edge before disappearing again. He told no one of this. The town, when asked, met his questions with silence or muttered the same name in low voices as if saying it too loud might draw something nearer. The Bell House. The name meant nothing to him yet, but the way it was spoken, not in superstition, but in the flat tone used for accidents no one wants to relive. Stayed with him. That winter the snow came heavier, covering the fields, but in his mind the curtains remained, swaying without wind, always waiting at the edge of sight. And though he tried to tell himself it was just a house, part of him already knew that whatever lived behind that red fabric had been there far longer than the winter, and it was not done watching. The clerk's office in Morgan County kept its records in a locked oak cabinet, the drawers swollen from decades of damp winters. When the file marked Bell, Eleanor was slid open. The papers inside smelled faintly of mildew and something sharper, a preservative tang that didn't belong in paper at all. The oldest tax record was from 1888, the year after her husband was listed as deceased from industrial accident cause unverified. She had paid the property tax in full every year since, never a day late, never with so much as a handwriting change on the signature line. In a county where most widows struggled to keep a roof over their heads, Eleanor's payments were not just consistent but precise, each sum rounded to the cent. No one recalled her ever coming into the office to pay. The ledgers showed deposits made in cash by unknown couriers, each carrying the same folded note with her initials in looping script. The receipts told a stranger story. Over the years she purchased bolts of cloth, not in the modest lengths a seamstress might need for dresses or curtains, but in industrial quantities measured by the yard in the hundreds. Red dye, imported and costly, appeared on her orders every spring. The dye was noted as high saturation, medical grade, the kind used by hospitals to mask the stains of blood. And there was salt, barrels of it, purchased in the off-season when prices were highest, stored in a way that suggested preservation rather than cooking. Salt had always been a part of rural life, but never in these amounts and never paired with cloth orders so vast they could have lined the interiors of churches. The clerk who first noticed the pattern wrote a small question mark in the margin beside one invoice. No one followed up. It was not just the ledgers that spoke. The photographs kept in the county archive, brittle with age, told their own quiet lie. In one, dated 1893, Eleanor Bell stands on the porch of a building only partly finished, her hands folded neatly before her waist. She is not beautiful in the common sense. Her face is narrow, the lines of it sharp even when young. But there is something in the way she holds her mouth, a faint suggestion of patience, of calculation. Around her are 6 women of varying ages, all dressed in plain work clothes. Their faces are hard to read, the resolution too poor to capture expressions clearly. But each one has the look of someone who has stood still because they were told to. None of those women appear in the census records 2 years later. In the next photograph, Eleanor is older, her hair pinned in a severe knot, her dress dark but clean. She sits at a long table with 5 other women, the plates before them empty, as if the meal had not yet begun or had already been taken away. This image was found in the possession of a traveling photographer, not in her home, and the back bore no inscription. What is clear in the washed light of the photograph is that Eleanor's hands are in motion, folding something pale and soft on her lap. It is too small to be clothing and too textured to be paper. Some say it was cloth she was mending, others insist it was a strip of something else entirely. The census omissions were never investigated. Rural records often lost track of women, especially those without property or male relatives to anchor their names to the tax rolls. It was easy for the town to explain away their absence, marriage, relocation, work in the cities. But when the names of those missing were placed beside Eleanor's purchase records, the dates aligned too cleanly. A bolt of cloth ordered within weeks of a disappearance. A shipment of salt arrived just before a new face appeared in one of her rare photographs. What made Eleanor unusual was not simply that she could conceal such a pattern. but that she did so without ever stepping into the public eye. She attended no church, shopped at no market, and was remembered by no shopkeepers. The people who delivered her goods said they left them on the porch and were told to take their payment from a small tin nailed to the railing. Sometimes, in the low light of winter, they thought they saw the red curtain shift behind the window, but when they looked again, it was still. In every record, Eleanor Bell remains a quiet constant, a woman who never sought attention, never raised her voice, and yet moved money, goods, and people through her hands with an efficiency that suggested she was working toward a design only she understood. The ledgers did not show her intentions, but they showed her control. Every yard of cloth, every pound of salt, every vanished name was measured, timed, and placed in a sequence that left no room for accident. In this, her mind was not the mind of someone reacting to need or desperation. It was the mind of someone building something one piece at a time, hiding the final shape in plain sight. And in that patience, that refusal to hurry, there was a discipline colder than the winter itself, a discipline that would hold until the last seam was sewn. The men sent to appraise the Bell property arrived with ledgers and cold breath, their boots cutting dark lines into the crusted snow. From the outside, the house looked neglected but sound, its frame straight and roof intact, no sign of rot or collapse. But the moment the front curtain was drawn aside and they stepped over the threshold, every sound in the clearing seemed to vanish. Inside, there was no scent of timber or dust, only a faint chemical tang mixed with something warmer, almost sweet like the air in a tannery. The light from their oil lamps fell against walls that were not walls at all, but great swaths of stitched fabric, layered thick enough to hold back the wind. The panels stretched from floor to ceiling, their seams neat and deliberate, the thread so fine it disappeared into the surface. At first glance, the patches seemed random in size and shape, but as the men moved deeper into the house, they saw a rhythm in the cuts, a hidden pattern in how each piece joined the next. The fabric was not new. It had a dull sheen, worn but enduring, as if it had been chosen not for beauty but for permanence. In the lamplight, certain patches caught their attention. The texture was wrong. Not the weave of cloth, but something smoother, grained tighter, like leather worked by a skilled hand. One man reached out and pressed his gloved fingers to the surface, expecting the cool give of old fabric, but instead found a faint, almost imperceptible warmth, as if the material had been absorbing the heat of his body before he touched it. The color varied from pale cream to a deeper, uneven tan with fine lines that could have been part of the hide itself or something older, remnants of whatever the surface had once been before it was cut and sewn. No two pieces matched perfectly, yet the stitching drew them together into a whole, making the differences seem intentional, almost ceremonial. The rooms had no corners as they should. The layered fabric curved and bowed slightly inwards, swallowing sharp edges, turning every space into an enclosed cocoon. Moving through the house was like walking inside the folds of a shrouded body, each step muffled by the layers. Their lamps picked up strange irregularities in the stitching. Tiny raised bumps, as if something beneath the surface pressed outward, then vanished when they leaned closer. In one narrow hall, the walls seemed to shift in the lamplight, the folds tightening as though reacting to their movement. A draft passed between them, but the air was too still for that to be possible. One of the men, a surveyor from Bloomington, later swore that when he placed his palm flat against a panel near the back room, it pushed faintly against him, a slow, measured movement like the exhale of lungs. The others laughed it off in the moment, but none stayed in that room longer than they had to. It was not the sort of fear that makes a man run. It was the quieter kind, the kind that roots itself in the mind and tells you something here is alive, and it knows you are standing too close. They noted in their reports the extraordinary craftsmanship of the stitching, the uniformity of the thread, and the remarkable preservation of the material despite the damp winters. What they did not put in writing was the suspicion that the preservation was not accidental. The warmth, the resilience, the faint elasticity of certain panels, all hinted at treatments more complex than any known upholstery. One man thought of the barrels of salt Eleanor Bell had been known to order and of the red dye shipments, and for a moment he imagined the process. The soaking, the stretching, the cutting, the careful joining of each irregular piece into a flawless surface. As they moved toward the center of the house, the layers thickened. Some sections were 3, even 4 panels deep, stitched one over another as though earlier work had been hidden beneath. In a corner near the hearth, a loose seam revealed a glimpse of an older layer inside, a darker material, rougher in texture, as if the surface had been turned inward deliberately. The sight made them cover it quickly without discussion, as though even a few more seconds of looking might press an image into the mind too deeply to erase. By the time they stepped back outside, the cold air hit their faces with the sharpness of something cleansing. They marked the structure as sound but unconventional in the official papers, and none of them spoke of the warmth in the walls again. Yet each carried the memory in silence, the feeling that the house had been breathing around them, and that the fabric was not simply sewn to hold a shape, but to hold something in. The disappearance of Ruth Mather in the spring of 1890 was at first treated like so many others in the scattered farms of Morgan County. An unfortunate mystery softened by the hope she had gone to the city for work. Ruth was 15, the youngest of 7, a girl whose chores kept her mostly near the yard and whose world had never extended beyond the edges of her father's land. On the morning she vanished, she had been sent down the main road with a basket of eggs to sell to a woman her mother described as well-dressed, soft-spoken, and respectful. That was the last anyone saw of her. Neighbors recalled no commotion, no cry for help, only that Ruth had been walking beside a figure in a dark coat who seemed to be speaking to her in low tones. By dusk, her father had walked the length of the road and found the basket abandoned, the eggs unbroken, set neatly by the ditch as if placed there by a careful hand. 2 weeks later, the Mathers received a package in the post. There was no note, no return address, only a square of cloth folded with precision, dyed in a deep red so rich it looked almost wet. The stitching along one side was flawless, too flawless. Tailors in town admitted they could not match the seam, the thread buried so perfectly it left no raised line, each puncture invisible to the eye. Mrs. Mather kept the cloth for years, hidden in a drawer, certain it was meant as a message, though she never said from whom. When she finally spoke of it decades later, she admitted the fabric had never lost its faint warmth, even through winters so cold they froze water inside the pail. In the county records, the date of Ruth's disappearance coincided with one of Eleanor Bell's earliest recorded purchases, a bolt of cloth ordered from a supplier 2 towns over, along with an unusual quantity of red dye. The order was marked urgent, delivered to the property in less than 2 days. The supplier's grandson would later tell investigators that his grandfather had been paid in gold coins, the likes of which he had never seen before or after. He also claimed the woman who met him at the edge of the property did not speak a word, only nodded, and that her gloves, though spotless, seemed unnaturally thick for the mild weather. The town spoke of Ruth less as time passed, her name slipping from conversation as if the silence could protect them from whatever had taken her. Yet whispers persisted, always tied to the Bell name. A few of the older residents admitted when pressed that they had heard of other girls, always alone, always carrying something small. A loaf of bread, a bundle of cloth, a note, and always last seen walking toward a solitary figure who never came to market. No bodies were found, no belongings recovered, except for the occasional folded scrap of fabric sent to a family who dared to ask too many questions. These scraps were never alike in shape or size, but all shared the same impossible seamwork, the same muted warmth. Years later, when the first investigators stepped inside the bell house and saw the walls layered with panels of irregular material, some of those same families were shown samples taken from the seams. Most refused to look. Those who did said the texture was unmistakable, though none could bring themselves to say why. The connection between Ruth's folded cloth and the surface of the bell house was never proven in court, but among the people of Morgan County the link required no proof. They understood that in Eleanor Bell's world nothing was wasted, not even the skin that once held a life, and that the red curtains were not decorations, but memorials stitched in a language only she knew. The county doctor remembered Eleanor Bell as a woman who never raised her eyes when she spoke, as though even conversation was something she measured and rationed. In his ledger, her name appeared rarely, yet when it did, it was never for illness. She came for supplies, not for herself, but for her household, though no one in town had ever seen the faces of those who supposedly lived with her. Among her most frequent purchases were barrels of salt, always in pairs, always ordered in late summer when preserving meat was common but not in such volume. The amounts she bought could have preserved the carcasses of entire herds, yet no one recalled seeing livestock on her property. The salt was delivered in sealed oak casks, and those who hauled them up her porch claimed they were heavier than they should have been, as though something within was already saturated. When the investigators entered the Bell House decades later, they noted how well the fabric walls had resisted time. Unlike cloth left to the mercy of Indiana winters, these panels were pliable, their seams intact, their colors still deep and rich. Samples taken for analysis revealed traces of sodium chloride in concentrations far higher than in preserved leather. But there were more. Microscopic residues of a chemical compound similar to one used in old anatomical laboratories to keep tissue from hardening into brittleness. Combined with the salt, it would prevent decay while leaving the surface supple to the touch, warm enough to respond faintly to the heat of a hand. Whoever had treated the panels had done so with a method not found in any public records, a method both precise and purposeful. The doctor had his own memory of Eleanor's methodical nature. Once she had ordered a small quantity of brine solution, claiming she needed it to clean stains from imported fabric. He had suggested a less expensive alternative, but she had only stared at him with a stillness that made him drop the matter. He later wondered if that stillness was not disinterest, but a quiet weighing of whether he had seen too much. She had left without another word, her payment exact down to the cent. The coins had been warm when he took them. Among the oldest farmers, there was an unspoken belief that salt could do more than preserve. It could bind. A salted hide could not only last for decades, but, in certain old superstitions brought over from Europe, could also tether something of the life it once held, keeping it from leaving entirely. In some whispered accounts, this was not preservation but imprisonment, and those who practiced it did so for reasons that had nothing to do with keeping meat edible. The doctor never spoke of such things in public, but when the Bell House was found to contain walls that breathed faintly in the cold, he remembered those whispers. In one corner of the house, near the base of a staircase that led nowhere, the floorboards bore faint streaks as though something wet had been dragged across them and salted afterward. The investigators noted the unusual absence of rot in that section of wood, suggesting it had been treated with the same compound as the fabric. Samples taken from between the boards revealed small, crystallized grains, their centers tinged faintly pink. The grains were old, fused to the wood itself, but the color had never faded. It was as though the salt had absorbed the essence of whatever it had touched and refused to give it up. There were rumors, never confirmed, that the last courier to deliver salt to the Bell property had returned pale and sweating, claiming that when he arrived, the curtains in the main room had been pulled back. Behind them, he said, was not the wall he expected, but a layered surface that glistened faintly as if freshly washed, the seams still damp. He swore he had heard a faint sound, not of movement, but of something settling like fabric being smoothed by invisible hands. When asked what Eleanor had been doing, he said she was kneeling with her back to him, a wooden bowl beside her, dipping a folded cloth into a brine so strong he could smell it from the porch. She had not acknowledged his presence until she had finished whatever she was doing, at which point she had risen, placed the bowl out of sight, and thanked him in a voice so even it might have been rehearsed. The salt barrels continued to arrive at regular intervals until 1911, the year before Eleanor vanished from public record entirely. What she did with the salt was never officially determined, but in the quiet corners of Morgan County, the belief persisted that it was never meant for food, never meant for any purpose the living would admit aloud. The Bell House did not simply stand against the decay of time. It seemed to hold its breath against it, as if waiting for something or someone to return. And in that stillness, in the silence that followed every delivery, there was the sense of a ritual completed, a promise sealed grain by grain. The craft inside the Bell House was not the hurried work of someone hiding a crime. It was the slow, exact labor of a mind that believed the process itself was sacred. Each panel of the house's interior had been cut, fitted, and joined with a precision that bordered on obsession. The irregular patches were never truly irregular. Measurements taken years later showed they all conformed to ratios so consistent they might as well have been copied from a single pattern. The cuts were clean, made with a blade sharp enough to leave edges without fray. Each curve deliberate, no wasted material. Every seam began and ended with a tiny knot buried so deep in the thread it could not be found without dismantling the panel entirely. The thread itself was stronger than anything available in the local stores at the time, suggesting she either spun it herself or acquired it from suppliers willing to sell without asking questions. Witness accounts that surfaced long after Eleanor Bell's disappearance all described the same ritual before the sewing began. Each girl taken was measured 3 times, wrist, thigh, and nape of the neck, using a strip of cloth knotted at each end. The measurements were not written down but memorized, committed to whatever system Eleanor carried in her mind. It was only years later, when a textile historian examined surviving fragments, that the meaning became clear. Those 3 points determined the natural tension of a hide when stretched. By knowing them, she could cut the material to fit into her panels without warping the surface, ensuring every piece lay flat and unbroken for decades. The act of sewing was to her as much a preparation as it was construction. Survivors, though there were very few, spoke of the quiet, steady rhythm of her hands, the way she hummed under her breath without melody, her eyes fixed not on the work but on the space just beyond it, as if seeing the finished form in her mind. She did not work in daylight. The stitching was always done at night, the house lit by a single lamp whose flame was turned low enough to leave most of the room in shadow. The slow draw of the needle, the tug of the thread, the almost imperceptible sound of something tightening against something else. It was a sound that once heard could not be mistaken for any other. In the few scraps left unmounted in the walls, the seams tell their own story. Some are backed with layers of fabric that seem too coarse to serve any functional purpose, suggesting they were remnants from earlier work, pieces cut from failed attempts and saved for future use. The consistency of these remnants indicates a careful culling, as though she kept them not out of thrift but because they still carried some value she could not discard. When questioned, Those who had glimpsed her work before it vanished into the walls said she would pause between each finished seam to run her hands over the surface, pressing lightly as though feeling for flaws only she could sense. If she found one, she would unpick the stitch entirely and begin again, no matter how much time it took. In this precision was the logic of someone who did not see herself as cruel but as a custodian of something fragile. She was not discarding what others would call waste. She was preserving it, giving it form and purpose beyond the life it once belonged to. To her, the act of stitching was not destruction but a continuation, an act that denied finality. And it was in that denial, in that refusal to let the material simply decay into the earth, that the deeper cruelty lay. For the living, death was released. For Eleanor Bell's choice, there would be no release, only an endless presence in the fabric of the house, bound tight by the same stitches that kept the seams from failing. When the investigators later traced the dates of missing persons to the acquisition of new materials, they found no gaps. Each disappearance was followed within weeks by the purchase of fresh dye or heavy thread. The ritual was unbroken for over 2 decades. In every piece of her work, there was the echo of the moment she took those measurements, the quiet in the room before the first cut, the steady pull of thread through something that had once been warm in another way. And though the panels of the Bell House are gone now, burned or buried, those who studied them swear that if you closed your eyes and ran your fingers along the old seams, you could still feel that rhythm. The patience of a hand that never hurried, the certainty of a mind that believed the stitch itself was the truest form of permanence. In the winter of 1910, the Bell House was found abandoned, its curtains drawn tight as if to keep the cold from crossing the threshold. Deputies sent to secure the property expected dust and disuse, but the moment they stepped inside, they felt the strange heaviness of air that had not moved in years. The oil lamps they carried cast long, trembling shadows across the layered fabric walls, and that was when they noticed it. The curtains and panels swayed slightly as if a breeze were passing through, though every window was sealed. The motion was too measured to be chance. It seemed to start deep within the house and move outward like a ripple in water. They stopped in the hall to watch, but the shifting slowed until it was still again, leaving only the faint creak of thread pulled taut. One deputy, a young man named Carter, walked ahead into what had once been the front room. The fabric there was heavier, the layers thicker, and when his sleeve brushed against the panel it moved, not in the loose flutter of cloth, but with the resistance of something alive adjusting itself under a touch. He stepped back sharply, claiming later that he felt the surface contract, like muscle tightening beneath skin. The others laughed nervously, but none of them touched the walls again. Carter's lamp shook in his hand, and the swaying began once more, though this time there was no doubt it came from somewhere deeper in the structure. In the back corridor, where the panels met at narrow angles, the motion became more deliberate. The seams seemed to flex, and in certain patches the fabric bulged slightly before flattening again. Under lamplight, these movements gave the uncanny impression of breathing. Slow inhales, slower exhales, the kind that belong to a body in deep sleep. It was an idea so unnatural that none of the deputies dared say it aloud, but each felt the same awareness. The house was not shifting in response to them, it was adjusting to their presence, as if marking where they stood. The official report made no mention of the movement. Instead, it listed the property as structurally sound, if unconventional, with unusual settling cited as the likely cause for any perceived motion. But privately, one of the men told his wife that while he was in the hallway, the fabric nearest him seemed to gather faint wrinkles in a shape too deliberate to be random. For a moment, he swore it resembled a human expression, not one of fear or sorrow, but of someone on the verge of speaking. Before he could look away, the folds smoothed back into place, erasing all signs of the shape. There were other small incidents they would not write down. The faint rustle was heard when no one was moving. The sensation that the light from the lamps dimmed when they stepped too close to the panels, as though the walls were absorbing it. The oppressive warmth that seemed to radiate from certain sections, enough to bead sweat at their hairlines despite the cold outside. These details lived only in memory, unspoken, because speaking them would force the men to admit they had stood inside something they could not define, something that did not belong in the ordinary world. Carter left the sheriff's office within the month, giving no reason. The others continued their work, avoiding assignments that took them anywhere near the Bell property. In the years that followed, when the house's reputation grew darker, they each kept a certain silence about what they had felt there. It was not the silence of fear, but of men who understood that some experiences could not be explained without inviting the wrong kind of attention. Long after the Bell house was dismantled, a fragment of fabric from the main room resurfaced in a private collection. Those who examined it claimed that when held in the hand, it seemed to flex slightly, as though resisting the grip. The stitching was flawless, the preservation remarkable, but it was the faint rhythmic shift beneath the surface that left them unsettled. It was not enough to see, only to feel, and once felt, it was impossible to forget. The swaying in the abandoned rooms had been no trick of the air. The Bell house had moved because it had never been empty. The discovery of the ledger came almost by accident. One of the appraisers, prying up warped floorboards in what had once been the sewing room, found a shallow cavity hidden beneath. Inside was a wrapped bundle tied with string, the paper stiff and brittle from years in the damp. When they cut it open, a small leather-bound book slid into view, its cover unmarked except for a faint circle impressed into the hide. The circle was pierced by a single straight line, an emblem none of the men recognized at the time. The pages inside were yellowed but intact, filled with neat columns written in an unwavering hand. At the top of each column was a name, 27 in all, each paired with one of the strange symbols. Beside the names were dates and what appeared to be measurements, 3 numbers written in a consistent order. Later, historians would recognize the markings as similar to those used by European executioners in the 17th century to catalog the garments made from the hides of the condemned. The symbols were a kind of code, denoting not only the origin of the material but its intended purpose. In Eleanor Bell's ledger, they appeared beside every name, repeated with an exactness that suggested she had not merely borrowed the system but had adopted it entirely. The measurements matched those recalled by the rare survivor: wrist, thigh, nape, ensuring that each piece was cut with no waste. The ledger was not a list of deaths. It was an inventory of raw material. Every name in the book corresponded to a missing person reported within a 50-mile radius over a span of 23 years. Some were known locally, others came from farther afield: servants, seamstresses, young women traveling alone between towns. Their disappearances had been scattered in time and geography, easy to dismiss as unrelated until the ledger bound them together on its pages. None of the entries described the act of taking them. There were no notes of violence, no cause of death. Each name was simply followed by a date and the kind of precision one uses to record the weight of a shipment or the length of a bolt of cloth. At the back of the book, on a page set apart from the rest, was a series of sketches. They were rough but unmistakably floor plans of the Bell house, each one annotated with symbols that matched the marks beside the names. The walls were shaded in patches, some darker than others, as though marking the placement of certain panels. Cross-referencing the sketches with the ledger, investigators realized that each darkened section corresponded to a name, as if the entire interior was a catalog arranged in human remnants. The bell house was not decorated. It was organized. The presence of the ledger posed a question no one wanted to voice. Had Eleanor kept it for her own record, or had it been meant for someone else? The precision, the coded marks, and the fact that it had been hidden so deliberately suggested it was not simply personal bookkeeping. In certain secretive guilds, such records were handed down, their symbols understood only by those taught to read them. If Eleanor had learned this system, then somewhere there might have been another set of eyes expecting her to maintain it. Even more unsettling was the condition of the book itself. The leather cover was not ordinary cowhide. Under magnification, it revealed patterns too irregular, too organic to have come from an animal. The grain was finer, the pores smaller, and though no one put it into the official report, those who examined it privately agreed that the ledger was bound in the same material that lined the walls of the house. In binding her record with it, Eleanor had closed her circle. The process of taking, cutting, stitching, and preserving had extended even to the record of the act itself. The ledger disappeared from public custody before any formal investigation could be completed. Some say it was taken by an officer who feared it would draw attention the town could not endure. Others believe it was claimed by someone who understood its codes and intended to keep the knowledge alive. Whatever its fate, its absence left a gap in the official story, one the county was content to leave unfilled. But among those who had seen its pages, the memory of those names, written in perfect rows beside the quiet geometry of the measurements, was impossible to forget. The bell house had been more than a place. It had been a system, and the ledger proved that every panel, every seam, every breath of movement in those walls was part of a plan executed with the cold patience of a mind that saw people not as lives, but as parts to be catalogued and used. In 1932, more than 2 decades after Eleanor Bell vanished from public sight, a woman named Clara Hensley lay dying in a charity hospital in Indianapolis. She was 70 by the records, though the nurses whispered she looked closer to 90. Her body was wasted, her voice barely more than a rasp. But when a young attendant mentioned Morgan County in passing, her eyes sharpened with sudden clarity. The attendant, unsettled by the change, fetched a parish volunteer to sit with her. And it was to this stranger that Clara finally spoke of what had happened when she was 12 years old. Her account would never be taken down by police or written into any official file. It would exist only as a memory passed between a few who believed her, and even they wished they had not heard it. She told of being taken from the roadside one autumn evening, the light fading fast, the cold rising from the ground. The woman who approached her was neither hurried nor forceful, just a steady presence with an even voice and a gloved hand that rested lightly on Clara's shoulder. Clara remembered the strange calm that settled over her as they walked together to the bell house, though she had not known it by name at the time. She recalled the interior being warm, almost stifling, and the faint smell of salt and something like metal. The walls were draped in the red curtains, and behind them she could hear the faint sound of fabric shifting like breathing. Eleanor measured her 3 times, wrist, thigh, nape, each touchlight almost gentle. She was told to stand still, to keep her eyes forward. Then came the cutting. Not fast, not violent, but with a precision that Clara understood even then was rehearsed. She was never struck, never shouted at, only moved and turned as the woman worked. The pain was there, sharp and bright, but Eleanor's manner drained it of panic, as if convincing her that what was happening was simply a necessary task. She described being sewn into a panel while still alive. The fabric was pulled around her, enclosing her in a way that pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. A wad of cloth, warm and wet with brine, was pushed into her mouth, the taste burning her tongue and throat. She could not cry out, could barely move, and the steady pull of the needle and thread through the layers was the only sound. Time lost its shape. She could not tell whether it was minutes or hours before her vision began to dim. Eleanor hummed softly, not a tune, just a low vibration that seemed to move through the walls themselves. Clara believed she was dying when, without warning, the fabric loosened around her. She was lifted, carried to the porch, and left there in the cold. The woman's voice told her she had been spoiled by something she did not understand, perhaps a flaw in the material, perhaps an imperfection Eleanor could not accept in her work. Whatever the reason, Clara was discarded, mistaken for dead. She lay there through the night, the brine soaking into her clothes, until a passing wagon driver found her at dawn and took her to a nearby farm. The scars never faded. Even in her last days, Clara's skin bore the fine, straight lines of the needlework, the puncture marks, so even they could have been made by a machine. She had never married, never stayed long in one place, and always moving when she felt eyes lingering on her for too long. She claimed that in dreams she still felt the pressure of the panel closing around her, the faint warmth of the fabric against her cheek, the sound of thread pulling through something not meant to be sewn. When asked why she had never spoken of it before, she said no one would have believed her, and even if they had, it would not have changed what had happened to the others. She didn't just want to keep them, Clara whispered to the volunteer as her voice began to fail. She wanted them to stay. Hours later, she was gone, leaving behind only the story and the knowledge that at least one of the walls in the bell house had once been alive and aware inside its seam. By 1941, the bell house had stood empty for more than 30 years, its curtains drawn tight against the seasons, its fabric walls outlasting even the oldest of its neighbors. But the winter storms that year were heavier than any in memory, and the weight of ice on the roof finally forced the structure to give up. It did not fall like a wooden house should. There was no clean break of timbers, no sudden crash. Instead, the building seemed to sag inward, the roofline dipping slowly as though the interior were softening, the walls breathing one last time before surrendering. Those who saw it from the road claimed the fabric rippled in great slow waves, like something shifting in its sleep. When the county sent men to dismantle what remained, they expected to find rotten boards and mildew, but the work quickly became something else. The outer frame had collapsed in places, exposing the layered panels beneath. Many were intact, their colors still deep despite the decades. Others had torn, revealing seams that led deeper into the structure. Behind these seams were not empty cavities, but older panels, darker in tone, stitched over with such care that it took hours to separate them. These underlayers had a different texture, rougher, uneven, and yet preserved in a way that defied explanation. The deeper they dug, the more they realized the house had been built in layers upon layers, each new disappearance likely followed by a fresh addition to the walls. In the central room, where the roof had fallen completely, sunlight touched the inner fabric for the first time in decades. The warmth of it seemed to awaken something in the material. Workers reported a faint hiss, as though the panels were shrinking from the light. One man swore he saw a section draw inward slightly, like a muscle contracting. Another found that when he tried to cut a section free with his knife, the blade snagged on something dense within the seam, something that pulled back before giving way. What he pulled free was not thread, but a thin, twisted cord of darker material that, when examined, appeared to be sinew. It had been tanned and treated, but its origin was not animal. The smell grew stronger as the dismantling went on. Not rot, but a chemical bite laced with something faintly sweet, the scent of the old brine and preservation agents Eleanor had favored. It clung to their clothes long after they left, and several of the men refused to return for the final days of the work. By the end of the week, the last standing panels were brought down, and what lay beneath the floorboards confirmed what some had already guessed. Sections of fabric rolled tightly into cylinders, bound in twine, stored like bolts waiting for use. These rolls were damp to the touch despite the cold, their seams sealed so perfectly that no moisture had escaped into the surrounding wood. Inside them they found more of the dark, rough material, pieces unfinished, perhaps waiting to be cut and fitted when the time was right. The county ordered the remains of the house to be burned. In the morning, the piles were set alight. The flames caught quickly on the outer wood but hesitated when they reached the fabric. Witnesses claimed it blackened slowly, curling back in tight spirals, and from the seams rose a sound like steam escaping a kettle. It was not the sharp crack of burning timber, but a long, drawn-out hiss, as though the material was resisting to the very end. The smell was thick and cloying, carrying far across the frozen fields, and for days afterward the snow in the clearing was tinged with gray. The ground where the bell house had stood was left bare. No marker was placed, no fence erected. The county wanted it forgotten. But those who had worked the dismantling whispered that the house had not simply fallen, it had let go, collapsing only when there was nothing left to hold in place. And in the center of the cleared space, where the last of the panels had burned, the soil stayed damp long after the snow had melted, as though something beneath the earth still held the memory of the fabric and the quiet weight of all it contained. It was late February, weeks after the bell house had been burned to the ground, when the first strange snowfall came. Morgan County had known long winters, but this storm was different from the start. The air felt heavy, the clouds low and swollen, and when the snow began to fall, it carried with it a faint pink hue. At first it was dismissed as a trick of the light, the sun setting behind the thick cloud cover. But as night fell, the pink deepened into a soft, unmistakable red, tinting the ground, the roofs, even the frozen creek. In the morning, farmers stepping outside found a thin crust over everything, a dusting that, when gathered in the hand, stained the skin faintly brown red. Children were told to stay indoors. Water from melted snow pots left a residue at the bottom that clung to the metal, and no amount of scrubbing would remove it. By the second day, the storm had spread across 3 counties, and though the color faded as new snow fell, the early layers remained, pressed underfoot and locked in ice. Some families scraped it into jars, sending samples to the local doctor and the agricultural office. Both returned the same uneasy answer. The particles were organic, their composition consistent with trace amounts of human collagen and hemoglobin. No official explanation followed. The county commissioner claimed it was caused by dust from a far-off drought region mixing with the snow, a rare but natural phenomenon. But in Morgan County, where the smoke from the bell house still seemed to linger in the air, no one believed it was natural. The timing was too close, the color too much like the deep dye Eleanor Bell had favored for her curtains and walls. And then there was the smell, faint, metallic, the same scent that had filled the clearing on the day the house burned. Some swore they saw the red snow fall heavier over the site of the bell house than anywhere else, drifting down in slow spirals as if drawn to the ground it covered. Even after the snowplows cleared the roads, patches of the red crust remained in the clearing untouched by wind or melt. When the thaw finally came in March, the ground beneath these patches was damp and soft, as though it had held the meltwater longer than the rest of the field. In those places the soil was dark, almost black, and carried the faint briny tang that old-timers recognized immediately. For years afterward, locals would recall that winter whenever the wind shifted in a certain way, bringing with it a smell they could not name but always recognized. Some believed the storm was the house's last act, a scattering of itself across the land it had occupied for more than 2 decades. Others whispered that the red snow was a sign of something unfinished, that whatever had been bound within those walls had been released, carried up into the clouds, only to fall again in a slow, quiet rain of itself. The county never investigated further. Samples sent to the state laboratory were returned without comment, and no public record remains of their analysis. But in the back rooms of the library, where the local historians kept their private files, a single glass vial sat for years, half filled with the red-crusted flakes. The label bore no date, only the words, "Bell House Snow." Those who handled the vial claimed that when held in the warmth of the palm, the flakes softened slightly, releasing a faint, almost imperceptible scent of salt and something older, something that once lived. Even decades later, when the story of the Bell House had faded from public memory, the red snowfall was still spoken of in low tones during long winters. It was a reminder that fire had not erased everything. Some things do not burn away. They rise, drift, and fall again, settling into the earth or into the folds of whatever waits to hold them next. The photograph turned up by accident in a crate of glass plates rescued from a flooded basement. Its edges nicked, the emulsion cracked like thin ice, yet the scene was clear enough to change how people spoke about the Bell House. The penciled date was 1889. Eleanor stands before the unfinished frame, a narrow woman in a plain dress, hair pinned tight, chin level. Her posture is calm in the way of someone used to holding still. In her right hand, she holds a needle longer than her forearm, steel catching a pale band of winter light. Behind her, a red curtain hangs in the bare window where a door should be. At first glance, it looks like any heavy cloth with a soft blur across its center. Only when the plate is viewed under a lamp does the blur become a face. It is not sharp, it is not staged. It is the kind of shape a person makes when pressed from behind. Features dim, mouth slightly open, as if breath had moved the weave for a second and then stilled. Prints were made in cautious batches. The county historian carried one to the state college, where a technician with a steady voice and careful hands inspected the plate for tricks. He found none, no double exposure, no scratch that could mimic eyes, nose, and mouth. The light on the needle matched the light on Eleanor's sleeve and on the curtain's fold, all coming from the same angle. There was a faint shadow at the hem of the hanging cloth, a narrow oval where the weave bent inward as if under weight. The technician did not say the word body. He described tension in fibers and a depression consistent with pressure from within. He also pointed out the smallest thing most people missed: 3 tiny puckers along the left edge, evenly spaced, the kind a heavy needle leaves when it passes through thick material pulled tight. The marks were not proof. They were a signature. The negative was cleaned and viewed again. More details rose from the gray. A seam runs down the left side of the curtain, so fine it looks like a soft crease until the light hits and the line sharpens. Along that seam, the thread shows in 3 spots where the camera caught a tiny glint. The thread disappears elsewhere, buried in the surface, but those 3 glints make a path the eye cannot ignore. Near the center of the blur that looks like a face sits a darker oval, soft-edged and low. Under higher magnification, it shows faint pores. No one put that in the public catalog. Those notes were kept in a file marked technical and filed under nuisance. Even so, they traveled quickly through back rooms and quiet halls and ended up where they always do in small places, inside people's heads, where they grew heavier with each retelling. Eleanor's expression is the most ordinary part of the picture and the worst. She is not triumphant. She is not stern. There is a faint rise at one corner of her mouth, a small, firm smile like the kind a person makes when a job is on time and the tool in the hand is right. It is not kindness. It is approval. She stands with the confidence of a worker who trusts the plan she made the night before. Her free hand rests near a low table. On that table, under a cloth, The outline of a shallow bowl sits in plain sight. The cloth is wrinkled in a way that suggests dampness. A narrow length of something like cord peeks from beneath it and coils once before, vanishing under the fold. The table's leg nearest the window carries a faint smear that runs down and dries mid-drip. Someone tried to scrub that smear at some point because the grain is raised there, gray wood turned pale and rough by brine. Debate formed along the usual lines. One side said the face was only damaged, an emulsion stain shaped by water and wishful fear. The other side included men who had stepped into the house years later and felt the panels give like warm leather. They said the blur looked exactly like what a wall would show if something behind it pushed once to breathe. They said the seam glints and needle puckers were not a coincidence. The technician returned with a brighter lamp and traced the shadow of the needle along the sill and found, at the very edge of the frame, a smear shaped like a hand with fingers splayed, as if pressed from the other side. He did not add that to the official note either. He wrote an anomaly instead and signed his name neat and small. That night he checked the plate out again and looked at it alone. He returned it in the morning without a word. People who had seen the ledger placed the photograph beside the list of names and stared a long time. The date on the plate matched 3 entries in the book, all marked with the same symbol, a circle crossed by a line. None of those women were ever found in the census. A seamstress in town kept a copy of the print folded in the pocket of her apron and touched it at closing time, as if to remind herself that a stitch holds and also wounds depending on the hand. The photograph did not make Eleanor into a legend. It made her into a person who planned. The smile says the plan is working. The needle points toward the dark of the doorway. The curtain holds its shape as if air inside it is warm. The house behind her is not finished in this picture, but it is already decided. When the plate was finally sealed in a climate box, scholars came to argue in dim rooms about process and intent. Some left saying it was nothing more than light on wet emulsion. Some left quiet and pale, holding their tongues until they reached the hall. Either way, the image did what the ledgers and the stories could not. It showed the mind that hid behind simple habits and careful purchases. It showed how a hand can look harmless while it holds a tool meant to turn a person from a life into a surface. The photograph does not give us a scream. It gives us a worker at the edge of her work, steady, patient, certain. And through the curtain, for the length of a breath, another certainty looks out and changes nothing. Because the seam is already measured, the thread is already cut, and the house has already chosen what it will be next. After the photograph, the story no longer felt like a rumor. It moved in straight lines through offices and courtrooms, through cold basements where evidence lay in boxes, through classrooms where young people learned to see what most look away from. In 1943, the state approved a missing persons registry with real teeth, forcing county clerks to file reports within days and to cross-check new disappearances across borders. Morgan County pushed for it first, and the Bell name was never spoken into the microphone, yet it sat heavy in the room like a coat nobody claimed. Training changed as well. Students studied thin slides from saved fragments, traced salt crystals, and were told the lesson was not about fabric, but about what patience can do when the face behind the piece is forgotten. Supply rules tightened. A purchase threshold flagged large orders of brine compounds, tannins, and heavy thread. Merchants had to log deliveries to rural addresses that rarely showed a public door. Health codes added window and egress rules, so a house could not be sealed by curtains alone. The laws were dull on paper and sharp in life. Together they made it harder for a single mind to build a private system inside a public county. None of it brought anyone back. It only made the next house less likely to breathe. Confessions surfaced in odd places once the registry found its steady rhythm. In 1956, a supplier's grandson carried a locked tin to the sheriff. Inside lay receipts, 2 red-stained rags, and a short letter saying he had sold industrial dye for cash to a woman who would not give her name because the money was warm and the year was lean. In 1961, a retired midwife died across the county line and left a sealed note to her niece. It described a small, precise woman who paid in full for brine and gauze and insisted on quiet, then asked for help lifting something that did not feel like laundry. In 1968, a road worker found a courier's diary in a barn. The pages told of deliveries to a porch where a tin box clicked open by itself, and a voice behind a curtain said thank you as if reading a line. These papers did not solve the case. They solved the question of whether silence was shared. The land changed only in small, stubborn ways. In 1975, a stone marker was placed near the clearing, paid for by a quilt guild and a farmers' cooperative. It carries no names, only one line, for the ones who were used and not returned. People leave needles there, point down in the soil, or loops of thread knotted 3 times. Some touch the ground and whisper a name. Some say nothing and listen. Most years the field grows high and thick. Some years it lies flat and hard. The stone stays. The state archive kept the plate in a climate box and the prints in a binder no one checked out. But the image moved anyway, copied in quiet hands and taught as a warning. Every few years a rumor rises about an order with old marks, about a seam taught to a niece by a silent aunt, about a night class in preservation offered without a name. Some say she needed no help. Others say systems never stand on one post. The dark comfort is to believe in a single wolf. The truer fear is that many hands can pass a habit along without speaking, that evil can travel like a pattern, taught with pins and patience. When people ask what the lesson is, the historians speak softly. They say evil here did not roar. It counted, it saved, it paid on time. It hid inside habits no one wanted to interrupt because the habits made life easier for everyone who was not inside the walls. The Bell House shows that the worst harm can look like simple work done well. It shows how a smile in a photograph can be nothing more than approval of a plan. The case ends, if it ends at all, with that knowledge. A registry exists. A stone stands. The field grows what the weather allows. People marry, leave, return, and forget until winter comes hard and the wind makes a sound like thread pulled tight. Then someone remembers and looks toward the pastures where a house once held its breath and wonders whether the quiet thing that lived there could be built again by patient hands in another time. What do you think? Could this happen again? In 1972, a judge unsealed affidavits from the old case files. The pages confirmed the ledger existed and named 3 couriers who had lied under oath. In 1990, the registry became statewide law in full.